Yeah.
Yeah, the other person was just here. I keep losing your address. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us early on Friday morning for this session where we're going to be focusing on passive chlorination and the implementation environment for passive chlorination. So we'll start off with a few presentations that will give us a bit of an overview and introduction to what passive chlorination is and a case study. And then we will do some systems mapping exercises in groups to think about the wider kind of actors and processes that need to be in place to implement passive chlorination sustainably. We'll have a few videos from the field to see some examples of passive chlorination implementation programs that are ongoing at the moment. And we will hear from Meryl, who will show us some of the work she did for her master's, where she actually created some systems maps for the enabling environment for passive chlorination as well. And then we'll have a chance to come back to the maps in the room and online. We'll be using a Jamboard for those who are online to throw in ideas, and then end with a few reflections. So without further ado, I want to welcome Katja and Megan, who are going to present first.
Thank you, Saskia. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Katja Chirakomeli, and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Berkeley with Dr. Amy Pickering.
And I'm Megan Lindmark. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa, working with Dr. Craig Jess.
And today we're really excited to share with you an overview of passive inline chlorination for drinking water disinfection. This is a paper that Megan and I worked in collaboration with many co-authors, some of whom I met for the first time during this conference. You can use this QR code if you want to read the paper, and we'll dive right in. So what is passive chlorination? Passive chlorinators are devices that have been developed to continuously and precisely dose chlorine, specifically at tap intake, so at the point of water collection. The advantages of passive chlorinators are that they don't require electricity for operation, and furthermore, they don't require daily active user input. So before we go into the suite of technologies that have been developed, we want to talk about the water sources that are suitable for passive chlorination. Then we want to think about when those water sources are piped, people actually use them either through storage tanks or taps at their institutions or communities. And of course, that brings us to the end users. Who have these devices been designed for, and how can people actually use them? So passive chlorinators can actually be installed at multiple points along this chain. And we'll first focus on the water sources themselves. Recently, I worked on a publication that should come out soon. We were using the Joint Monitoring Program WASH data in addition to the multiple indicator cluster surveys. And this gives us an overview of the different types of drinking water sources that people are using worldwide at the household scale. So our study found that primarily people are using piped water, which we classify as being compatible with passive chlorination, packaged and delivered water, or boreholes and tube wells, which are really common. You can see in rural South Asia, for example. The purpose of this paper was actually to estimate the global target market for passive chlorination, but I won't get into that. I want to really focus on the actual water sources themselves. So here I show you of the 3 most commonly used drinking water sources, what is the microbial E. coli contamination at the point of collection? So the main point of this graph is just to show you that many of these sources today that are being used, measured at one point in time at the point of collection, are quite contaminated, regardless of whether you are in urban or rural regions around the world. So this motivates us to think passive chlorination could help address this issue. In addition, I was curious to ask the question, are people currently treating their water at the household, and what are the patterns we see? So these are the 3 most common technologies that came out of the mixed surveys: boiling, filtration, and chlorination. And the main takeaway from this figure is that chlorination is actually much more common in certain parts of the world, specifically in African regions of the world, than in the Asian regions, where specifically filtration is much more common. So this is something as implementers, practitioners, researchers, we need to think about in terms of people's experience and exposure to chlorination as a whole.
So now that we've talked a little bit about water sources, we can kind of dive into the rest of this continuum from the water source to the end user, and specifically thinking about where chlorinators can actually be installed, as well as what type of devices exist. So Katya and I mentioned that review paper that we recently published. In it, we looked at around 27 research papers, as well as spoke with NGOs and received reports from them. And we found around 27 passive chlorination devices. Now, the majority of those were solid tablet erosion chlorinators, and a few of them were granular chlorinators or liquid chlorinators. And so each of these papers looked at kind of some different metrics and indicators to evaluate the effectiveness. And some of them looked beyond just typical technical efficacy and actually evaluated implementation settings, as well as financial models and those sorts of things. But one of the most consistent indicators used was this dosing consistency down at the bottom. So that's the proportion of samples that a given chlorinator delivers at above 0.2 milligrams per liter free chlorine residual. So you can see looking at the solid tablet erosion chlorinators that they had some of the most variable FCR dosing consistencies. Then looking at the granular was relatively low. Now remember, we only had a sample size of 2 for those chlorinators. And then finally for liquid was on a fair bit higher dosing consistency than those other 2 types of chlorinators. And you can see that there's some range for the typical costs as well.
So just to give you a preview of one of the few liquid chlorinators that's currently being designed, the Venturi is a device that Dr. Amy Pickering and I and many others have been working at UC Berkeley and other institutions. Our designers here are industrial designers, mechanical engineers that have really created a design which we are looking to mass manufacture this year. So this is injection moldable, and some of the components will also be rotomolded and blow molded. And it's quite simple. We have a 2-liter chlorine reservoir where you can pour in liquid chlorine. And the basis of how this device doses chlorine without electricity is that as water is coming in through that influent pipe and going through this Venturi component, the chlorine is dosed through the Venturi effect proportional to flow. And we have a needle valve for fine-tuning adjustment in case the incoming water changes. So now, just to give you an overview of the different types of end users that were described in these 27 evaluations that we've reviewed, many of them were focused on community users, and specifically in rural settings. These reviews were conducted over 16 different countries, and for communities ranging almost up to 3,000 people. A few of the evaluations were also in healthcare facilities, and even fewer were in emergency health response settings, such as refugee camps.
So in addition to reviewing those papers that I mentioned before, we also kind of collated all of that information to establish what are the current limitations to scale for chlorinators and what are some research priorities that we can identify. So one of the first things is chlorine supply. So availability of chlorine is really critical. One of the things we can do to overcome that is leverage electrochlorination, which uses electricity to generate chlorine on site. And then financial and business models. So how do we actually make it so communities can afford to use these systems? And so some of the things needed in future research is validation of effective demand, O&M cost needs to be assessed, user satisfaction, et cetera. Next, operation and maintenance is one of the most critical things to the success and effectiveness of chlorinators. And so one of the ways that we can overcome that or assess that is using sensor-based monitoring to actually improve O&M response rather than base it off of like a circuit rider type model. And then finally, water source compatibility. So of those chlorinators that we assessed, none of them were particularly effective for use with hand pumps, and hand pumps represent a pretty significant proportion of folks needing safer drinking water. So we need to adapt passive chlorinators for those water sources.
Great. And at this point, that concludes our presentation, and we'll take 3 minutes of questions. I'm just going to quickly look at the Zoom chat to see if there are any Q&As. Oh, okay. We got a comment that there's a lot of background noise. Please control. I'm not sure. Tech people, if you're hearing that, please try to help. Okay. Do we have any questions in the room or from the virtual audience? Yes.
You have a 2-liter container. When did you design the volume, the concentration of chlorine?
Yeah, so just so you can all hear, the question was, we have a 2-liter container in the Venturi design that is the UC Berkeley device that we're trying to scale up. And what was the motivation to decide on this particular volume? So currently, this device has been designed over the last 10 years iteratively, and our current system has a 1-liter tank. And we use 1.2% either water guard or aqua guard, that's liquid chlorine that's being sold widely in the market. And so if our target is 1 parts per million chlorine or around that range, then that can treat up to 18,000 liters of water. So right now it's been installed in community settings primarily, but moving towards thinking about institutional settings like schools, healthcare facilities, the usage might be higher, and we might need to reduce the chlorine refill frequency just for operational ease. So we decided to increase the volume of the tank in the future design to 2 liters. So that would go up to, almost close to 40,000 liters of water treated, depending on what you choose your target dosing to be, which can be controlled with the needle pump. Thanks for a great question. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. In your paper that's under review, were you able to think about or look at turbidity of water sources at all?
You're talking about the global target
Yeah,
market paper I
yeah.
presented earlier. That's a great point. He asked, did we think about turbidity of water sources? So just to clarify, we didn't really discuss this point, which is really important, but in terms of implementing passive chlorinators, we want to screen the water sources to think about the turbidity level and sometimes the iron level, because many of these devices are only going to function with high efficacy if the water has low turbidity and low iron. And so this is something we're screening for in our field implementation, and something you can address with pre-filtration and adding on other technologies to treat the water. But specifically in that paper, the mixed data, it only has water quality related to microbial contamination. So there aren't other sources of water quality parameters or components that are in there. So unfortunately, that doesn't feed in, but that's a great point to think about in terms of the actual users. One question in the back from our co-op.
How does the way devices handle intermittent supply, which is an issue?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on the form of chlorine being used. So some of the tablet chlorinators tend to kind of, as the water flows through them and then stops flowing through them, there's this drying and wetting period, which can affect the way that it dissolves. So some of them have been adapted better to intermittent supply than others, but largely that's kind of a remaining gap that needs to be resolved, is making sure that they all work well with intermittent supply.
So thanks to Katja and Megan. Just a note for those who aren't aware, Megan Lindmark is submitting her PhD this afternoon. Thank you so much, Megan, for making the time for all of that. That's really impressive. So we're gonna invite next up Anna Murray from the Aquia Institute to talk to us about some of their work. So let me just try and get your slides up. Okay. There's a lot of windows open here.
Thank you. My name is Anna Murray. I'm a senior research manager with the Aquia Institute. And I'm going to present on behalf of colleagues who did this work. So I'm pretty new to Aquia. So this is work that was done mostly by Catherine Marshall and Joyce Kisiangi. It was also funded by the Hilton Foundation. So I want to also acknowledge them. So these are two separate evaluations that Aquia did on passive inline chlorinators. So the first one here is the Purol 50H. And these are both hand pump chlorinators. They're both use tablets with the erosion process that we just heard about. So this one, it's commercially available. We evaluated this in a potch in Uganda. And we're looking at, with both of these technologies, we're looking at first technical performance. So looking at free chlorine residuals, and then also some, implementation feasibility, like what types of settings might these be successful. The second one is called the new pump. This was developed by Water4, and we evaluated this in Ghana in Wassa East. So this is sort of a, not commercially available product. It's still under development. And we were looking at, again, the technical performance as well as a business case for scaling this. So they were interested in how viable that would be. So some of the just brief methods. So we looked at, again, chlorine residual measurements over time. We also did qualitative interviews. For the Purol 50, we noticed some issues, which then led to a study on chlorine longevity that came out of this work. And with the new pump, again, technical performance, we also did a willingness to pay study to look at kind of the financial viability for that model, and did some also qualitative interviews. So the technical performance of the two hand pump chlorinators was not perfect. As we just heard, there's a lot of variability in this type of technology. So so we looked at I'm reporting here the mean free chlorine residual at the hand pump level, with the new, and then the percent of those daily values that we found with detectable chlorine. So for the new pump, the performance was slightly better. So we saw 82% of the samples were within, had detectable chlorine, and within an average value that we would expect. The Purol 50 was lower, so only about half of the samples had detectable chlorine. So it's quite variable. When they did have detectable chlorine, they were at, an adequate level, but 0.4 milligrams per liter was a bit on the low end. And here's just a photo of the interior of the new pump. So this is a bit more complicated. So it does have abilities with valves to dose it in different ways. So it is adjustable. And then the Purol is just sort of a one size fits all adaptation. So through the qualitative interviews, we found that there is an impact on the user experience. So in both cases, people reported reduced flow rates. It was harder to pump. Because they go onto the end point of the hand pump, people found it difficult to actually get the water into their containers in the way that they normally would. And so it did have we saw in some cases, maybe some source switching where people were not, interested in using this source and they went to a different one. So that was one of the challenges. And so one of the findings here is that, I should also say both of these were implemented in programs that had circuit rider hand pump maintenance programs. So we put them in these settings thinking that it would be on the easier side to, okay, it already has this program set up. There's mechanics going to these hand pumps on a regular basis. They'll just work into their normal process to, add the chlorine tablets when they're needed. But we really found there's more of a learning curve here. So it was more difficult than we anticipated. So for example, with the Purol, only 30% of the hand pumps had the chlorine tablet when we visited. So that was much lower than we had anticipated. So kind of ensuring that this, the chlorine is consistently delivered, monitored and replaced really requires a lot of motivation by the organization that's implementing it. We did find some potential to increase user fees to support the cost of chlorination. So as I mentioned, we did a willingness to pay study. This was in Ghana, and we used a few different methods. I'm just showing one of them here. So we saw, for a control, communities that did not have the chlorinator versus treatment controls that did have the treatment, communities that did have the chlorinator. We saw an increase in reported willingness to pay. Of course, this is not actual willingness to pay, and we would expect the actual may drop a little bit. But with the different methods we looked at, it was about, people were willing to pay about twice as much for hand pumps with chlorinators. Interestingly, with the water for model, they were looking at the viability of the business model, and they actually decided that, with all the other considerations, that this wasn't quite enough money to make that a viable model. So while people were willing to increase, that wasn't enough. In Uganda, we did not do the same willingness to pay, but just based on other data that it didn't seem like people would be willing to pay because there was already some issues in that regard. Another main finding, so one of the benefits or potential benefits to a system like this is trying to reduce the need for user behavior change. And we actually found that it doesn't quite eliminate it. So there still is a need for some amount of education and behavior change at the household level. So if we want to have safe water at the source, right when it comes out, then this is good. But we know that through the transport and storage and handling of water, that there's still reduction in that chlorine. And so keeping the water safe at the time of consumption, we actually did not find great evidence that this was carrying through to the household use. So I had mentioned this earlier that we did a bit of a follow-on study to one of these. So looking at free chlorine residuals at the hand pump, the household, after 24, 48, and 72 hours, because we found that people were storing water past 24 hours. And so we see here the free chlorine residual really dropping at all of those time points. And so there's a question about the dosing and the free chlorine we were measuring at the hand pump was quite low in many cases. So would it actually last throughout this time period? So just to summarize here, I think these are promising technologies, but we're kind of realizing that that consistent technical performance for the hand pump chlorinators is really a challenge. And this idea of pairing it with a maintenance program is while promising, still not enough to ensure the success of these. And finally, there still is some need for individual behavior change, even with this technology. So I'm happy to take questions. There and then.
Great to see, thanks. What needs to change on the maintenance program in terms of training to make that more effective?
Yeah, so I think one of the main concerns was maybe motivation at the organizational level to some extent. So my understanding is that within the program, it was felt that, oh, people don't want to chlorinate their water anyway, this isn't going to really work. And so there wasn't really the motivation at the top to trickle down to then the mechanics who were going to it. So they didn't really prioritize it. And also from the individual mechanic perspective, they're busy, they have a lot to do. And this was kind of adding extra work for them. And so they would normally go and do their maintenance and move on. And now suddenly they had to test the chlorine and then check for this and carry extra supplies. And so it was sort of a change that I think organizationally they weren't really committed to, and that kind of trickled down to the rest of it.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Anna. We had done a study in Bangladesh that also used the pyramid. And one of the things that we had observed, or we were receiving as qualitative feedback from users, was that they could sense, taste and odor wise, a lot of change in chlorine that went into their containers. And I was just curious, we weren't sure if it was the population we were working with was more sensitive to taste and odor changes, but I was curious if in these cases where it was implemented here, if you have heard that at all.
Yeah, so the question was about taste and odor perceptions from users with a similar technology, one of these technologies evaluated in Bangladesh. Yes, we did have some kind of complaints also from users about taste and odor in both of these.
Throughout the use of it.
As far as variation throughout the use, I don't know. I can follow up. Okay, let's go 1, 2, and 3 if we have time.
My understanding of one of the other downsides of the Purell is that you have to physically alter the hand pump, usually when doing that last 90-degree bend. The new pump, is there a similar requirement to kind of damage or alter the existing infrastructure, or can that be kind of more easily installed?
I'm not sure because I wasn't in the field to do the work, but I can find out. Although I will say that Water4 has decided to not continue the development of this any further. So it's probably not going to go to market and be a commercially available product in the future. I think there is still some modification to the hand pump, but I don't know to what extent.
I just was wondering about your thoughts around messaging to the consumer with this reduction in chlorine residual. Has that been done? Have you thought about, one needs to drink one's water within 2 days, or one needs to do something, or we overdose a little bit? How are you thinking about that sort of side of things?
Yeah. So as far as storage times go, actually, when after this evaluation in a pod in Uganda, they did go back to the same communities where the data was collected to present the results, and the messaging was around water storage times. So I didn't actually present the E. coli results, but with those declining FCR, free chlorine residual, we did see also increasing E. coli counts. And so the messaging that went with the results dissemination was about storage time. So trying to keep it under 1 day or 2 days. Storage time.
One more quick line.
I would just wanted to first clarify, like, when you're saying 60% had detectable free chlorine residual, but then there were like 30% that didn't have tablets. You're looking at just 60% of that 30% that had tablets?
Yes.
Yes.
Great question.
Okay.
Yes.
So then what do you think is going on for this 40% non-dosing when there aren't tablets? Like, what do you think is going on in that?
I actually don't know.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can follow up because I didn't do the field work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was what's the cause for the
Right,
low?
what's the technical failure when there are tablets, but you're not non-dosing event? Right, yeah.
Running out of tablets,
Running out.
burning it all up, and then nobody refill.
I think that 60% was from the ones that actually had the tablets. But let me follow up on that. I can check with my.
I think Joyce, who did a lot of the field work, is here.
She's
Not
in
in
another session.
She's in another session right now, but she'll be around at lunch, so track her down if you need to follow up. So we have a video now from EOS International about some of their work. I think Anna has started to introduce us to some of the challenges here for actually making these implementation programs work in reality, where something might look really good on paper and then there's unforeseen complications. So we'll see another example from EOS International, and then we're going to get up, stretch, and do some of our own systems mapping and try to integrate what we've been talking about all week about the different actors and processes that are needed to be in place to actually make WASH programming work. So before we get to that, another case study just to hopefully trigger some thoughts.
Hola, my name is Wes Meyer, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of EOS International. We're a nonprofit social enterprise providing water quality solutions to more than 1,800 rural communities across Nicaragua and Honduras, Central America. At EOS, we've been working with water treatment, specifically community-sized inline tablet feeders, for the past decade, and have learned a lot over the process. Our model leverages market-based solutions where we sell water quality products and services to rural communities that we serve. First, to paint the picture of Central American rural water systems, the majority of rural communities have a piped water system where water is coming from a stream or river in the mountains, which is piped down to an elevated tank situated above the community. And then from that tank, it's distributed to the community itself, usually one tap per home. When our technician visits the community for the first time and takes the water test, over 85% of the time the water is contaminated with bacteria, as the majority of the water sources are surface water. While there has been the occasional contamination of arsenic, we found this to be pretty rare. Our program focused initially on just implementing water chlorinators in new communities, but we quickly learned that without much follow-up support or monitoring, the community would stop purchasing chlorine tablets and revert to drinking the contaminated water. We found common reasons for this reverting back included a change in leadership in the community water board, which happens every 2 years, or just that community members didn't fully understand the value of the chlorine and assumed it wasn't worth the additional cost. Our model has since evolved into now providing a more holistic approach to building the capacity of the community's water board, so their water system operates as a properly functioning water utility. While we feel the water quality component is critical and the solution is relatively simple, we found that it will not last without the other components of the water system operating properly. We've since implemented a circuit rider model where our technician provides support to about 50 to 60 rural communities located in a geographic region that we call districts. We've optimized our model into really 3 phases. Phase 1 includes the bulk of the implementation of the circuit rider model. First, we install an inline water coordinator in the system. Typically, this will go on top of the tank where the pressure is nearly atmospheric and chlorine is then dosed into the tank and it mixes and has time to treat the water before arriving at the home. Once the water coordinator is installed, the chlorine delivery supply chain now becomes really important. We've invested in setting up chlorine banks or distribution centers by identifying entrepreneurs operating a corner store to sell to the neighboring 8 to 10 communities. The entrepreneur then sells the chlorine for a profit, incentivizing their work. To date, we've installed about 60 or established more than 60 chlorine banks to serve the 1,800 communities that we're serving. Then every month following the water chlorinator installation, the circuit rider will visit the community and do an unannounced chlorine test in various locations throughout the community. We record the results to our cloud-based database, mWater, and share these results with the community water board members themselves. And if there was no chlorine found, we do a quick root cause analysis to understand why there's no chlorine. The results are also shared with the Ministry of Health to track trends and prioritize resources. During the monthly visits, our technicians will then proceed with the community training over the next 12 months, building the capacity of the community water board, providing 6 critical training topics: water source protection, water tariff, operation maintenance, etc. The circuit rider will also address technical issues that arise and help troubleshoot problems and then teach the community on how to fix that. We also provide water testing in our water lab where we analyze 14 drinking water parameters. On the economic side, communities pay for the water chlorinator at approximate price about $75 US, covering materials and installation costs. We offer the training and monitoring free of charge. We sell the chlorine tablets for a small profit to the communities at approximate price of about $1.30 per tablet, and these last anywhere from a half a day up to 2 days. And finally, we sell the water quality lab tests for about $15 to $40, depending on the parameters that we test. In the second phase of the model, we invest in training and transitioning the water quality monitoring to the local community members. We provide chlorine test kits and reagents for more than a year and train this person to take chlorine tests every month and send the results by text with a photo to the technician, to our circuit rider, where we upload the result into the same mWater database to show that historical analysis. And now this transition has been really important to really the sustainability of the model, and we found it actually works. As communities demonstrate self-sufficiency, our circuit riders then transition to new communities. And really this is the third phase of the model. While initially our circuit riders had the capacity to work amongst 50 to 60 communities, this third phase now allows our technicians to roll out and cover up to 250 rural communities. The circuit rider now mostly provides technical assistance if things go wrong or if things break based from the back-to-back hurricanes. But also train up new community board members as they transition, like I said, every 2 to 3 years. Another trend that we've observed across the communities that we're working in is a gradual decline of water supply. As most of our water systems are fed from surface water, it's typical for us to see cyclical flows during the rainy and dry season. However, we have heard from communities that year over year, the water flow seems to be getting lower. So now we've trained community members to measure this with the 5-gallon bucket and timer method and report to us. Again, we can document and see trends. And it's been scary seeing the decrease in water supply year over year. As a result of this lowering water supply, we are now modifying our model to include a component of watershed protection. And we're experimenting with working on communities to include an environmental tax, just a penny or so that would go towards reforestation of the watershed, which can improve the water quality, reduce runoff, and increase water supply. So in summary, while we started off as a water chlorinator implementer, we quickly learned that in order to ensure the communities had access to safe drinking water, we needed to take a step back and implement a more holistic solution. Thanks for your time.
All right, great. So hopefully that gives us a flavor of what we're talking about here, trying to implement passive chlorination in a variety of different contexts. The next thing I'd like to do is introduce a bit of an activity. So we're going to do some systems mapping in small groups in a minute. We can I like to think of a systems map as a diagram to organize and visualize different layers of information. So why would we want to do this? One of the key reasons is because it's a good method to think through and explore the complexity of a topic. And importantly, to build a common mental model. It's a way to critique or have a new view on potentially some assumptions that we might be making about settings, about systems, and bring in different perspectives on it, and hopefully form a bit of a common mental model to speak about. So there is no such thing as a perfect map. There's no right answer to this. We would expect different groups, systems maps will look quite different, but we're hoping to get some ideas onto paper. So what we'll want to put into the systems maps, we're going to have different sticky note colors to put in the actors. So thinking about government actors, media, citizens, researchers, whoever you think should be part of a system around passive chlorination, the processes, and then the structures that need to be in place. And finally, the sort of last part of a system here would be the function. Today in this room, we're going to identify the function for you. We want to try and build an ideal system map for sustainable, safe water supply with passive chlorination. So that's the challenge, the task. So build a system in which passive chlorination is sustainably implemented in a rural water supply. There are here, this is kind of, you can refer back to, I'm going to leave this slide up while we're doing the mapping. Think about the different nodes that you'll want to put in, and then the types of relationships that you want to represent in the map. So I find it helpful to think often about how information flows within the system, money, where's the financing coming from? That's a critical one, and then influence. So this might take different forms, and I don't want to be too prescriptive here, so I'll leave it to the groups to decide. But where possible, maybe add a word or a few words on the relationships that you're drawing to give a sense of whether this is funding, whether it's regulation, and what do the links represent. So we'll split now into, I think, 3 groups. We'll have one group there, one group in the back, and another group up here. For those who do have the whiteboards, feel free to use that instead of the poster board if you want more space to really expand out, but we're going to have about 15 minutes to do that in the room. And then for those who are online, at the top of the chat, you should see a link to a Jamboard, which is an interactive space where you can add sticky notes and links there. And of course, feel free to use the chat to try to work together a bit on that. So yeah, if we can move to the group. So I'll have Katrina leading one group in the back, if that's all right. And then Katja, if you could be up front here. And I'll ask Megan to lead the 3rd group. Anna, we have some questions for you from the online participants. So if you want to come up and type in your responses, we can get going. Then we'll do this for about 15 minutes and then come back and hear from Meryl about some of the systems mapping she's done on this topic. I will repost the Jamboard link, yeah.
Hello. What's your name? And where is it from? Hi.
It's hard to meet. Marketing that. It's like we're just pushing the ball.
So we just have about a minute to wrap up the
Yeah.
current thought, current
It's a
conversation.
challenging issue, but
Oh, yeah.
it's good to think what water would. Treat it. Instead of that.
Believe I've been muted, sorry to those online. So before we go back to the mapping, we're going to just spend 15 minutes to hear from first evidence action from Colin. Sorry for pausing it. Colin. We're going to hear a bit about their program moving into inline passive chlorination, because we heard a lot from evidence action about the droplet-based dispensers. I think they were talking about that yesterday for those who were able to make it, but we're going to hear about so their new programming, and then we're going to hear from Meryl, who has done some systems mapping herself. And after that, we'll come back to our groups, hopefully get in some links there, because we've got a lot of nodes and not a lot of links so far. And we'll have some time for reflection at the end. So we spare you, Colin.
For the past 2 years, Evidence Action has been exploring inline chlorination, or ILC. We see inline chlorination as a next generation water technology that has the potential to enable us to expand our reach and deepen the impact of our Dispensers for Safe Water chlorination program, allowing us to reach new communities and new populations. Today, we'd like to share with you some of our experiences so far.
So one interesting thing about inline chlorination is that the technology doesn't require behavior change of the users. Once the gadget has been installed, then that is automatically doses the water, and so whoever fetches water from a source that has been installed with the ILC then is not required to do anything. All they need is to fetch their water.
Adoption is a challenge in any preventative health program, and anything we can do to remove that from the equation, we consider a win. And that really is the key feature of inline chlorination from our perspective, that ability to remove the burden from the user and make consistent automatic water treatment the default choice.
With the experience of the staff that have been working on Dispensers for Safe Water program, the implementation of ILC hasn't been a challenge. The knowledge that the program has had over time has contributed significantly to bringing in on board the ILC. The program works in rural areas, and we've been able to see gaps where we are serving certain water points, and certain water points cannot be able to be served by the chlorine dispensers. Most of these water points serve many households, and the target that they are reaching is quite huge. And therefore, this has been kind of a call to bring in other interventions. And so ILC, DSW covers a massive area. And because we have staff working in those particular areas, we have offices, it's been easier to implement ILC. Most of these water points, getting them, reaching them, working with them hasn't been a challenge. The response to ILC has been very positive, not only at community level, but also at county level, because currently most of the counties are focusing on improving the lives of their citizens, and you will find that some of the projects that they are doing is installation of boreholes, drilling boreholes and installing solar pumps that can be able to distribute water to a number of households. However, the challenge they have is that they don't chlorinate this water, or they don't have other ways of treating the water. And so this is an idea that the counties were been able to put up ILC water points. It is an idea that the counties have really welcomed, and even the communities were been able to put up ILC water points.
At the beginning of this year, Evidence Action completed an inline chlorination pilot in Western Kenya. We installed 67 ILC devices on community water points. This pilot enabled us to get a sense of, are these devices successfully getting chlorine into people's water? What do the communities think about these devices and this program? And are we able to run and implement this? Based on the success of that pilot, we are now in the process of scaling up our inline chlorination program in 7 districts in southern Malawi. Beyond that, we are very excited to see where else this technology might be a good fit and how it might improve the health of communities.
Okay, great. So thank you. Colin from Evidence Action is in the room with us. So if people do have questions, either those in the room or if you're online, if you want to put some questions in the chat, Colin will be able to respond to those in the next breakout session. But for now, I'm going to invite Meryl up to talk about her work.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. I hope that was kind of fun, that activity, and different. So that's basically this is basically what I did for my master's research. So I just finished my master about a month ago at the University of Oxford. And I'd like to present the key results and findings to you. So the objective of the research was to uncover the facilitators and the barriers to successfully and sustainably implementing passive chlorination in small water supplies. So first, I tried to determine what the main factors of sustainability were in the system. So kind of figuring out these nodes, what you guys are doing. And then how these factors collectively constitute an enabling environment for implementation. And then I also compared passive chlorination with UV technologies, but this presentation will only focus on passive chlorination. So to do the research, I first did 26 interviews with stakeholders from academia, NGOs, public health institutes, and other research institutes. The people I interviewed were mainly from high-income countries, but the projects that they were working on were mainly in low and middle-income countries, ranging from Africa, Southeast Asia to Central America. With those interviews, I did qualitative content analysis. So I coded each interview to a set of nodes, which I'll explain in the next slide, and analyze some key quotes. And then I made systems maps myself. So first I made a sort of conceptual map of what are all the components of the system. And you'll see it's quite complicated, complex. And then I tried to make sense of that system using a conceptual framework. So what does the implementation environment look like? It's a lot. As you're probably starting with the brainstorm, you think of new concepts and ideas. So yeah, it's complex. And I'd like to note here that the technology is just a small piece of implementation. So there's so many other things that we should consider and think about when implementing a technology. To make sense of that big conceptual diagram, I used an implementation science approach, which specifically the REAIM framework, which is often used for public health interventions. And it's an iterative cycle that starts with reach. So in this case, looking at users, customers, then going to effectiveness, that looks specifically at the technology, then into adoption. So we're looking at how we communicate with our communities, how the device is perceived amongst communities. Implementation involves financing structures and service delivery models. And then finally, maintenance and sustainability involves a number of components ranging from climate resilience to supply chain, sensor, research, etc. So going back to this big map, how did I make sense of it? I used a causal loop diagram methodology to look at how the different components and factors interact with one another. So what kind of influence they have within the system. And what I'd like to note here is that there are some components that have a lot of arrows coming into them and out of them, which shows that they're kind of core parts of the system that should be given extra attention. So in this system, supply chain, sources of finance, and perception of device are kind of like core parts of the system, which influence a lot of other parts. And I'd also like to note that there are a lot of green stickies in the slide, and the green indicates maintenance and sustainability. So for long-term sustainability of the system, we need to consider things like source protection, water quality monitoring, sensor research, as I mentioned, supply chain, all of these components. So I'd like to just, conclude this slide with saying like systems mapping are a very good exercise to start new projects and to think about the other components outside of the technology. I'd like to go into a little bit of detail on this climate resilience components. So in light of climate change, technology should be considered alongside a suite of system improvements to tackle issues like turbidity and water provision, etc. So I divided climate resilience into 4 key components: water supply, energy consumption, material use, and emerging contaminants. So water supply, from the interviews that I conducted, was seen as a big priority. Source protection, and as Katja mentioned as well, passive chlorinators only work well if there's been a pre-filter or on less turbid waters. So source protection is really important. Energy consumption is not really an issue in passive chlorination because it doesn't require any additional electricity. But material use could be an upcoming issue, seeing as the use of sustainable materials is really important, and the plastic components of passive chlorinators may break down over time due to sunlight. Emerging contaminants are, of course, an important issue, but from my interviews, it was not seen as a low priority at the moment. And I'd like to say that sensor research is really important to save time and resources and financial capacity as well. Service delivery models are also essential, either through community managed systems or through an organization. So community-led service delivery models will require upfront training and communication. In addition, it can be combined with a circuit rider approach, or can be done separately from a circuit rider approach, which, as we saw in the video, involves a series of about a number of technicians that go to about 50 communities to monitor the systems, to refill chlorine and do any operation and maintenance that might be required. And this has been shown to be an effective mechanism to monitor technologies. Overall, the goal should be to reduce the often unpaid and gendered labor burden on both individuals and on technicians. And as was also earlier mentioned in Anna's presentation, inline chlorination is not entirely passive. There are still key elements of operation and maintenance that need to be considered. So some key considerations to close on. System thinking should be integrated at the start of new interventions. Local partnerships and contextualized solutions must be prioritized. We also noticed this just now in our group, actually, that it's quite difficult to think about these systems without having a context in mind. So it's important to contextualize these technologies. And finally, it's important that we continue to share our knowledge. So what went right, but also what was difficult and what might have gone wrong, to help inform future projects. So yeah, I would like to end on that note and also thank the University of Oxford and my supervisors for supporting me in this research, and happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess the obvious question after seeing that whole kind of complexity of systems. is, you mentioned, I guess, multiple arrows coming in and out. I guess, is that the bottlenecks? Or are those just the most important pieces? What do you feel like when you look at all that, people need to focus on more as far as the system?
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you mean in general or to this?
Well, I mean, like when I look at this, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, there's the technology piece you mentioned a little bit,
Yeah.
about the circuit riders.
Yeah,
I think everyone is concerned about sustainability. It's a big
Yeah.
question. I'm just thinking
yeah,
from, your heart, like,
Yeah.
what do you feel like are?
our importance. Yeah.
Issues that you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel from this research specifically, what's really important is engagement with communities. So not entering a community thinking we're gonna do this, we're gonna implement this technology, it's gonna be great. It's important that there is good engagement. And what I didn't see much of, but I hope to see more of, is participatory planning and participatory research methods. I think that's going to be really important. And a big bottleneck here is supply chain issues, especially in COVID. There's also a big issue with UV, is the supply chain, and sources of finance, I think, are really important to find sustainable business models. Because at the moment, a lot of finance relies on research grants or short-term funding. And I think it's going to be crucial that these systems are self-sustaining, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of the finance.
I was just gonna ask what you were surprised by, like either what was did not come up in your conversations with these service providers, or what did come up more than you thought about. You kind of addressed that a bit.
Yeah, I would say that those three components were quite big ones. Yeah. I was surprised at how much we were able to talk about things that were not the technology. Of course, that's what I was kind of looking for. But I expected the technology to perhaps appear as a bottleneck, but it often isn't. It's the other things around it that are. Yeah, gotcha.
Thanks, Meryl. That was a great presentation. This is something that Bruce had brought up in our discussion of systems mapping. Since it's so complicated and there are so many different fields of expertise that are covered in dealing with these different structures or processes, and the actors themselves are vastly different. Where do you think, or who should be the entity that's kind of leading these discussions? Because if you're thinking about the engineers, they aren't necessarily going to know how the national or county level governments are regulating water quality or where the funding is coming from and so on. So do you think there should be kind of a sole actor that's responsible for bringing all these people together? Or do you think, like, how can we self-organize to think at the systems level?
That's such a good question. Thank you. I don't know if everyone heard that, but it was about who should be the person, or who should be the entity kind of bringing all the actors together and bringing these components of the system together. I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think it's a really good one. I mean, ideally, I'd hope that everyone would want to work together. I think whoever takes the lead on the project should try to consider how to engage stakeholders and tie them together. But I think that's a difficult question to answer. But thank you. Yeah, Julie.
I was just like, when Hattie was saying that, it made me think like you have this list of people you talk to and contact information. I wonder like if people were willing, if you could put them in touch with each other, something like a Slack channel or like some sort of group community.
Yeah, I would love to do this. This
Yeah.
is something I was thinking about while doing the
Yeah.
research, like how do I connect everyone? Still need to think about what the best way would be, but I would
Yeah.
love to put everyone in contact.
Yeah.
I can add something to that. So that's actually something we wanted to do off the back of this session this morning, is follow up with those who are interested, to set up maybe some kind of discussion group, an annual meeting, some way to share, do knowledge exchange a bit more and keep a bit more coordination amongst everyone who's working on this. So thanks very much, Meryl, for presenting your work. And for all of that complexity, it gives you a headache sometimes, I know. So we'll go back to the maps now. We have about 15 minutes until the end of the session. So just a bit more time to think more about the links between all of the elements that you put up on the board. And also want to challenge to think a bit about some of the external forces that might be acting on this system. So as Meryl highlighted, climate change is a big one. There might be other things that you think are quite important. So perhaps you want to find a way to represent that in the maps. And then just before we wrap up, it would be great if there's a person from each group to just share a few reflections on what if the mapping process surprised you, if there's anything you thought about differently as a result of it. So I'll call us back when we have a few minutes to go at the end for that.
articulate this in terms of our framework, but you know, people are willing to pay, or they're are paying or not paying. Something for the water service, but are they willing to pay this much? Chlorine, sometimes they are, sometimes.
All right, so unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So we're gonna have to wrap up. Get the last pieces of writing done. And then if I
And
can just
sometimes you can have different, like,
wait for Andrew to. I wish we could keep talking, and we can into the break. Are you not able to hear me? Okay.
It's always a good sign. We're working.
Yeah, there's a lot of good discussion. I'm sorry to have to call us back to close, but we do have only a few minutes left, and then I'm sure everyone wants to get some cake. So just before we head off, maybe we can take a few minutes to reflect on all of the great discussions and share a bit across the groups. This is what everyone online has been working on, so I just wanted to put that out there. They have had a really difficult challenge. Of course, they're not in the same room together. They're messaging on chat and doing this quite independently, but this is what they've come up with. And I think one piece I really want to highlight here, what I really like is that research has been thrown in there, because I think often as researchers, we forget that we are part of these systems, and you know, what really question what is our role. Thanks to those online for making the effort to do this. And then maybe I'll start with the group at the back, because I just see an impressive number